I don't think there's anyone quite like H3 on the platform.
Guys.
That's equally a blessing and a curse. And today we shall investigate exactly why.
Watching the waves stare.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to The Right Opinion, the home of a twat with too much free time.
I think it doesn't.
And today we talk about h3h3productions. h3h3 is the YouTube pair comprising of couple Ethan and Hila Klein. They're pretty damn well known. There are loads of things that even people not particularly cultured with the internet will be familiar with, whether it was Matt Hoss or Vape Nation. They understandably have an overarching impact on YouTube past and present. That can never be taken away. However, there are a lot of narratives being drummed up right now, and to understand a lot of what I'm going to be discussing today, we have to go back in time. Now, the H3 account was created in 2011 on the 29th of April to be specific, originally made by Ethan and Hila to help Hila with her college project. However, due to my work on the Vape Machine, it appears they didn't start uploading properly until 2013. This isn't something I can confirm, but we can see that approaching the end of the year, they had around just shy of 2,000 subscribers, a modest but not insignificant amount, especially considering at the time one of their other videos had over 200,000 views. It's the foundations for a strong channel. What was the main source of these views at the time? Well, it appears to be mostly these EXE videos. The first real banger was Warm It Up, which really is a bona fide classic at this point. Most of these captured the very minute, seemingly irrelevant moments of an interaction, often by an eccentric, and put emphasis on them, almost exaggerating the more minor quirks, making them either mesmerizing or amusing. They still practice other types of video in this time span, and had videos that focus more on their own personalities, mostly Ethan at this point, who was like everyone's favorite creepy uncle. Not that I'm endorsing creepy uncles, of course I wouldn't leave them alone with the kids, but my point stands regardless. H3 was creating an identity for themselves, and this finally began to snowball towards the end of 2014, as they moved over to H3 reaction videos, which intertwined their creativity as editors and their slightly off-kilter humour. It worked for them and they experienced incremental success through it. All of these videos have kind of withstood the test of time, and the fact that many of their old reaction videos still perform relatively well with the algorithm is a testament to their appeal. Given how well many of them still perform, it would be easy to deceive yourself that you may have discovered them later than everyone else. I definitely fell foul to that mentality. I looked at their view count on these videos initially and thought to myself, wow, how did I not come across these guys sooner? But I was introduced to them by my friend when he showed me how to clean your gamer gear. I think I must have subscribed to them between 1 and 1.5 million at some point. I was definitely a sucker for the videos that place more emphasis on the editing rather than the skits, and the skits definitely have their place, without a doubt. But for me, YouTube comedy needs to be high energy and sort of unexpected to get me chuckling properly. Just my personal taste. I think another really important aspect of these videos was that they introduced a somewhat moral standpoint. Although it was often shrouded in large amounts of humour, which is expected, you also had the feeling that with videos like the pranksters, they were challenging YouTube in promoting them and challenging the pranksters in creating this content. Although this was regularly mixed in with other videos that didn't really have any deeper meaning rather than funny memes. And they did create some funny memes, so can't hate them for that. This definitely gave them the foundations to be a somewhat moral voice on YouTube, however, and over the years they would gradually become more involved in these specific controversies surrounding the platform and how they conducted themselves. Many creators typically avoid making separate videos to necessarily talk shit about YouTube guidelines or initiatives, and with creators like myself, I understand why. However, the format that H3 followed allowed them to branch out and led them to more directed videos on the Fine Bros, SoFlo, Antonio, and of course the infamous now removed Leafy video. Now, as noted, not all these videos were without their flaws, and he has subsequently retracted some of his statements. But what a lot of people appreciated about these videos is that they were done in a way that sought the betterment of YouTube as a domain. And I can respect that. On top of this, with these serious videos, they still intertwine some of their personal humour, and that made it a lot less of a tonal shift from their standard content, although it definitely existed on a spectrum. But still, it was them. And that's why I think sometimes serious videos from a creator out of nowhere can lose the personality. I have to admit, at some point, I kind of switched off from their channel, but not because their content was going in a bad direction necessarily, it was just moving in a style that I personally didn't find as funny, and that happens quite a lot for me. Channels evolve, that's natural, sometimes they'll evolve into your taste, and sometimes they'll evolve away from your taste. The fact that they turned to content that wasn't obscenely awkward or bad anymore, but more just popular, was understandable, just not for me. However, I did still follow them when they covered more controversies because they were one of the larger YouTubers who was prepared to stand up for YouTube values, and the viewer alike. Some people will say that they were self-interested, and that may or may not be true, but at the end of the day, a lot of their rhetoric was very pro-creator, and I'm glad he's done that. However, Still, all of this was overshadowed by the Matt Hoss situation, which at this point I shouldn't have to explain, but I will just in case my parents are watching. H3 made a video reacting to Matt Hoss. This was uploaded onto their second channel, Ethan and Hila. Matt Hoss got his knickers in a twist, tried to take Ethan and Hila to court over copyright infringement and defamation of character. The future of YouTube depended on the outcome, and Massive XL, they won the big fuck-off case, and Matt Hoss went into his shell, never to be heard of again. Well, I hope not, at least. This is essentially the history necessary to understand what is facing down Ethan and Hila today, because recently they have been the subjects of some fairly extensive criticism. And it's not like this has never happened before. H3 has definitely been under the spotlight in the past for some narratives that they've created, and have had their feuds and run-ins where they've come off looking slightly worse for wear. However, this newest drama seems to have created a narrative about H3, one that is a lot deeper than just they got this point wrong. So I think without further ado, we've got some unboxing to participate in. Are you ready? No? Well, too bad. We're doing it anyway. You see, everything I've documented up till now shows a gradual evolution, in a direction that you can completely understand why they've chosen, and they really establish themselves as individuals online through that. And that's not an easy thing to do, so fair play to them. So when you've grown an audience like that and given yourselves iconic personas, it only seems natural to branch out further. This is what they did with the H3 podcast. The H3 podcast really is a stellar idea. You take two very well networked and seemingly amiable individuals and you put them amongst a load of other popular YouTubers and celebrities who people are always interested to hear about. For H3, it was another step in their evolution as creators, so they're not necessarily left behind. It's a sort of well that shouldn't exactly run dry for a very long time, and so it seems like a reasonable extension. But it definitely did create new challenges for Ethan and Hila. It created this environment that puts them amongst other people. Which sounds weird in a way, you know, that's not a huge challenge, but Ethan and Hila don't have dominating personalities. Which leads us to our first incident that we're going to address today, Bill Burr. Bill Burr is a comedian, actor, and many more occupations relating to the media. He is also quite an assertive person, and when he went on H3's podcast, whereas Ethan often tries to bring the energy down to his level a bit, Bill Burr did completely the opposite and ended up trying to drag H3 up to his level, and completely out of their comfort zone. What this led to was Bill Burr being too quick on the draw for Ethan, and Ethan typically struggling to contribute to the conversation.
My dog, so I would say,
You know,
on some level, he must have known. Yeah. You're a really cynical guy, man.
I thought you were down. I thought you were going to be down.
That is a lot for me to say that.
I thought
you're
you were
like
going to be down, but
cynical
apparently I'm cynical even to Bill Burr. Shit.
And all the commenters were certainly by no means happy about this. This also led to a lot of people trying to draw narratives to Ethan's mental health state, which is something that we will address very soon. But I also think as an idea, it just represented a step too far for him. To me, Bill Burr and H3 are just not in the same league when it comes to this sort of interaction. Some of these comedians are just so used to thinking spontaneously that they're constantly outmaneuvering these social situations they're placed in, particularly when they're dealing with YouTubers, because YouTubers are unique in a way. They may be funny, but they may not be cut out for every situation like many other celebrities. Another example of this was when Norm Macdonald covered the red carpet interviews at the YouTube Big Live Comedy Show. I'm not sure why he was there. I think it's very possible that he just wanted to sit down somewhere and saw an enticing couch. But he was there, and the other co-hosts were absolutely steamrolled by him and his tour de force of personality. It does seem to be something that a few of these people have, so I don't necessarily put this awkwardness down to just Ethan, although he should have anticipated it a lot better. With every development in the past, they built off their already existing foundations. They made the EXE videos, then they integrated the EXT style into their reaction commentary, and then integrated the reaction commentary into more trending topics, and you can see that there was a cohesive direction. The H3 podcast is definitely a more ambitious move, but they reached this point where they could kind of do anything. You see, with the Matt Hoss situation, it kind of immortalized Ethan and Hila, regardless of what happened. An event with such huge implications not just gave H3 a reputation that cemented themselves, even as people who may not be the most followed channel on the platform. Their presence is undeniable. However, one would beckon the question, is being immortalized always a good thing? As the ironically immortalized idiom goes, you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And although I do believe the sentiment behind that phrase is slightly exaggerated, there is still an element of truth to it. So the question then becomes, are we reaching that stage? If Matt Hoss hadn't happened necessarily, if they weren't immortal, would the content carry them? It's a hard question, but for me, I think it is yes, though probably to a lesser extent. Generally, from what I've observed, although the new content is not necessarily my cup of tea, and the podcast probably isn't either, and they're by no means experiencing the level of longevity on their videos. You know, you can look at the statistics, and they're not necessarily bringing people back or getting into the recommended like the older videos do. They nonetheless still have a very committed set of viewers who I don't think would have necessarily deserted them, even without the level of controversy that they've been blessed with. Even when their credibility has been arguably undermined, such as the situation with PewDiePie, people have still stood by them. However, I do think the fact that they are more cemented than other channels will wear them out with some viewers. And also some commentators, which is probably why there are more people than normal that are out criticizing them this time, even though they haven't necessarily committed any huge wrongdoing. Some people may just be reaching a stage of inertia for H3, but as said, I don't think that's the whole story. I do think they would still be going strong. So I'm going to reverse the formula and say that the persistent fame hasn't necessarily been a bad thing for their fans, but it has been a bad thing for them. And that's the thing with Bill Burr. After watching the podcast, I don't think there was anything particularly bad about it. It was just a perfect storm, really. A slightly subdued Ethan trying to keep up with Bill Burr, who was just absolutely dominating it. And it just made for a rather stilted, awkward interview. The H3 podcast is a far cry from their previous content because it represents a much more down-to-earth version of both Ethan and Hila. And at times that's fine. Seeing the genuine side of a content creator helps humanize the connection with the audience. But equally, it means that there is no editing to protect them, no quick upload to drop which may prevent people from asking questions. Whatever they sit down and do, they have to do for a significant amount of time. It drains you, even though in some ways it might seem like less work. If you're on a bad day and the celeb turns up, a facade can be hard to maintain. And likewise, this is why people began to question if Ethan was entirely alright. You know, you're doing something like this fairly consistently, it can be a drain. It's like every idea that has spawned out of the H3 machine, and yet I think it's so much easier to pick it apart when it goes wrong, and that's what people did. As mentioned earlier, there were plenty of people commenting about the state of Ethan and questioning if he was completely happy as a person. I think Ethan's been through these motions before, but it was more revealing this time round, and to get the confirmation, we need to look to his main channel. H3 typically has an upload schedule. Maybe a video every couple weeks, maybe a video every week. This can fluctuate, but up until around 4 months ago, that was how it was structured. And then they just stopped uploading altogether. A complete halt. And then, after 3 months, they returned to a huge fanfare with an advert for their new game. This understandably annoyed a lot of people. People are craving your content and you return, give people the expectation, and then it's just some advert. People will inevitably be annoyed. So in response to the backlash, they made a video addressing what has been going on. Ethan noting that he was, quote, actually depressed, and also talking about Hila's loss of her father. Now obviously Hila's loss is extremely tragic and that cannot be undermined, but I wanted to address Ethan's points. Now, although it's reasonable criticism to say that Ethan branding himself as actually depressed, without any additional evidence could be perceived as a tad dodgy. In this instance, we're going to assume that he's telling the truth, as I do feel that judging by his halt in uploads, it must stem from some sort of lack of motivation, and a reasonable explanation of that is depression in this instance. And I don't think he has a reason to lie, so I'm not going to knock it. I think it is a likely case they continued the podcast for money. I do not deny that, at least as partly the reason. Equally though, I think it's a fallacy to then apply the reverse of that and say they stopped uploading on their main channel for money. They were doing it in the worst of times. But with regards to it, I think there are a lot of factors that have led to this point, because arguably they've had harder times and made it through. I think one of the defining points was the Matt Hoss situation. The Matt Hoss situation in many ways was very momentous for H3, as mentioned earlier. However, there are two elements that I really think made this situation play a part in their latest Burnout. Firstly, the intense burden. No matter what happened, they couldn't just stop. They had a huge responsibility to carry the future of a lot of careers. That wasn't going to wait up. The Matt Hoss situation was incredibly tense because although we all almost kind of knew it was fair use, having a court of more senior citizens who may not be in touch with how the internet works, it's so unpredictable, and it could have gone either way. And even though they had overwhelming support, they couldn't just stop paying attention to it. It was like revising for a test, but on a ridiculously broad subject, and you don't know the topics the questions are going to be on. On top of this, I think the fact that the Matt Hoss incident was, in a way, so momentous that once H3 had triumphed over him, it was hard to really proceed from there. What do I mean? Well, this argument comes from observation. Well, typically, as humans, it seems we're focused on a narrative, a progression, going from strength to strength. And I think that's particularly the case with YouTubers. YouTube is a market where we always like the feeling of going forward. Matt Hoss represents a huge step forward for us really as creators, but equally, I can see it suddenly subduing their lives afterwards. No longer do they have this constant threat to be aware of, and as that melted away, suddenly there was just a hole where that commitment used to be, which may be what provoked Ethan's depression, just the absence of something that used to be there, even if that thing that was there was pure chaos. Another problem I can see contributing to this is the whole progression of reaction commentary itself. I spoke at the start about what H3 used to do, and in a way, their brand of reaction commentary was kind of unique in their style and their demeanor. However, as documented, like creators, they evolved. Their first evolution was arguably their most iconic, as it took two separate elements of their channel and put them together and created the H3 reaction video. That tag in the video title is not just any old tag, it's an identity, and H3 reaction video is a reaction video like no other. It really is them. However, like every type of video, you either become tired and need to up the ante to keep yourself creatively stimulated, or you're threatened with extinction due to the landscape changing. And although in many ways the H3 reaction videos are timeless, there comes a point where you just can't quite recapture that magic in the way that you used to. Another really iconic example of this is Shmo Yoho. The Bed Intruder song is absolutely a classic, but it's something that could only work to the maximum in that miniature zeitgeist. H3 reaction videos could not go on forever, no matter how fantastic they were in the moment. However, moving away from that mold is a more general approach, and although they still had their quirks, it felt with every evolution they kind of moved away from what defined them. At first, their move to topics kind of had more moral weight, and that kind of shielded it, even when they were still reacting. And their involvement in YouTube drama as voices of authority meant that many people were distracted on those issues. YouTube drama isn't always great to be a part of, but it is often stimulating. Reaction commentary, however, is arguably at its least dramatic point in ages. A lot of the videos are fairly relaxed and inconsequential in their messages. And in the videos, they're no longer commenting on some corny production value or eccentric host. The real draw is some unhinged individual on Dr. Phil. It's not the same environment, and it's just not quite as fun to comment on. Eventually, you alienate yourself from what identified you as a creator. I feel that reaction commentary is at a bit of an ultimatum at this moment. H3 could probably make some content. They've given themselves a broad enough base to build off. However, they want to do something different, like this podcast. I can't blame them. And that's the thing, reaction commentary just isn't going anywhere. It no longer necessarily appeals to the core talents of Ethan and Hila. Once again, there'll always be something signature that no one can deny. But you can tell that with every evolution, they've kind of moved away from what they started with. And although it's important to evolve to keep up, and sometimes just because you become bored with your old style, you might realize that the content might not just do it for you. It might become something that you no longer have that passion for. And in effect, that's probably why Ethan and Hila needed a break, because it just felt like they were running on a bare bones reaction formula rather than the little intricacies of what set themselves apart in the first place. You have to make content that you're passionate about, and so more importantly, when Ethan talks about a break that he needed to reassess his content, I think that's completely understandable. He needs something more idiosyncratic to who they are as people, because in a way that's what set H3 apart. And I think in the last few months, it's become harder to stay in touch with that. At the end of the day, content doesn't just have to satisfy your fans, it has to satisfy you as well. And that's what's been lacking. As said earlier, I think H3 will still be successful if they carry on creating content, all drama aside. So I really think it must come down to a problem between them as creators. And I think they've reached a dead end in that way. But how do they escape that? Well, let's talk about it.
Oh my god, I'm gonna faint.
Due to these videos taking their time, by the time that this video is out, Ethan and Hila may have uploaded a new video to their channel. They may be alive and kicking, and if so, that's a good thing. However, I hope the negative backlash doesn't cause them to rush their next upload, because it really could be a defining one at this point. Their channel's been fairly off the radar for a few months, and now it's kind of come back in a way that's hyping up their next upload with an air of tension around it almost. They'll need to make it good. I think the problem is, with every dead end, it's hard to know exactly what to do. Now, this doesn't mean they can't reverse these situations, but they need to find a new formula that works for them as much as it does for the audience. With regards to the H3 podcast, I still think they have the capability to do a good job. They just need to avoid biting off more than they can chew, and definitely plan around their own priorities. The thing about the podcast is that it doesn't really need to evolve necessarily. A few tweaks here and there perhaps, but overall podcasts are the sort of thing that really come down to interaction between human beings. And if you have guests on that kind of throw the tone up and down a bit, It should keep its subsistence. Once again, like everything, it probably wouldn't last forever, but it definitely has a better shelf life than other types of content that typically ask for more audience engagement. With that said, doing podcasts can be a tiresome occupation, and even though I understand that you're booking people and you have to stick to a schedule, try to avoid the excitement of having a famous person on overshadowing the fact that you may not be in the best place to host that person. You have to be on form to handle someone as commanding as Bill Burr. I think that's what irked people. On one hand, you had the H3 podcast, which H3 was kind of forcing himself through, and yet on the channel he'd made the decision to withdraw. And the H3 channel is arguably more important to people. And on paper, it's easier to sit down and record yourself talking to someone, in comparison to having to create content on the H3 channel. However, the cracks show just as easily if you're not feeling it. And to be honest, given H3's volatile YouTube journey, I can understand why sometimes they're not feeling it.
Look around, you can see the boxes here. We're being evicted. We're moving in with my parents-in-law's house. That's our new apartment. We're moving into our new apartment there. Aside from that, I'm getting a lot of requests and complaints. People saying that my videos are really boring. People saying that I should put a little more effort into my videos to not be so lazy. Really wish that I could maybe find a little time, do a little writing, you know, make up funny videos, haha. Well, I don't have time. Yeah, I don't have that much time, guys. Pissed off. This baby's dead. Yeah, I can't save that baby.
H3 fans are a dedicated lot. Any commentator knows that. They've provided a high commitment to the channel through very tough times, through the Matt Hoss era, through the controversies that to some level they receive pretty hard-hitting criticism from. I don't think they're not understanding though. It's just when you have situations where you come back out of nowhere with the ball game, even if it was something that was out of your hands to an extent, it was just rather foolish. So now a load of commentators are kind of capitalizing on that sentiment of discontent, that flavor of inertia that may linger in some viewers' mouths, and trying to create a narrative that H3 isn't what it used to be. And you know what? That may be true. H3 isn't what it used to be, but I don't think it could be. I think to an extent that original content was not just defined by its production and its presentation, it was defined by its moment. And that moment has passed. And if there's one thing that I think the Matt Hoss situation did was give them a spell where they were really invincible because they represented something greater than just content.
So we will be the first client of this account that will be known as the Fair Use Protection Account, also known as FUPA. The FUPA continues to grow. The FUPA shall protect all of us.
And now we've finally reached the stage where that's worn off and some people are saying, oh wow, this isn't what it used to be. But it hasn't been that way for a while, even before the hiatus. Go back and watch those videos. And those videos are good, well made, entertaining, but they're not H3 reaction videos. They're what H3 viewed as an appropriate route to take. And now they're clearly reaching a stage where they question that. And that's because the landscape of reaction commentary has changed so much. And they do stand out amongst the pack as unique creators. But they still need to do something that feels like a progression for them. And they've done a lot. How do you do more? The H3 podcast was something more, but it's not necessarily completely for every single fan. And as creators, it didn't give them that necessary progression. And one thing I found is that some of us can never truly be satisfied. You see something, you have a goal, you want it, you work towards it, you achieve it, and then there's this rush. And after a bit, you realize that nothing's really changed. And as the initial excitement wears off and the dust settles, everything becomes routine again. Your life becomes a cycle. That's the case with anything. I think that's why a lot of people do YouTube in the first place, to break that cycle. But if we don't know what to do or where to go, we can easily return to that cycle. And as psychological studies show, a lot of us have a base mood that we return to regardless of whether we've had a good or bad day. So if H3's in a place that's not too great, then I can sympathize with his position and probably understand why. You need to keep throwing new ingredients into the frying pan. But what happens when the cupboard is empty? Generally, I like H3. I don't think they're perfect, and they definitely warrant criticism from time to time. I mean, hell, I may even criticize them in the future. But they're human, and that's okay, and they do stand up for a vision of YouTube, which is a vision shared by creators across the spectrum. And although it may be quieter right now, you don't know what's around the corner, and they may be really important in voicing that too. So I'm sure they'll have their time again at the forefront of the platform, because they do have a broad enough net. But unfortunately, it's just a bit of a drought at the moment, and they're probably feeling the heat. I hope they feel better soon, and I hope that they start creating content that they and their fans can receive a mutual benefit out of. Because at the end of the day, that's why many of us came to YouTube in the first place. Anyhow, another spicy video, another fun time, I'd say. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I get a lot of mixed opinions on Ethan and Hila. and this whole situation just kind of threw a new shadow over it. So I want to see what everyone thinks, and I would love to hear the feedback. I want to give a big shout out to my editors. If you can, I'm going to leave their links in the pinned comment below. I'd really appreciate if you go and check them out, maybe drop them some love. They do a great job, and it really does show, and I think they definitely deserve support for it. Also, if you want to reach me on Twitter, my Twitter is @TheRightOpinion. Sometimes I respond to comments, but other times I don't. So if you want to talk to me, that's the best way. I do have open DMs. You want to reach me on Facebook, you can. I'm on there too. On Discord as well. I've been a bit more active recently. Once again, it's all about balancing time. Anyhow, I don't think I have too much else to say. Thanks for all the support as always. Hope you guys are having a lovely day, and I hope my video has helped with that. However, until then, I'm The Right Opinion, and I'll see you in the next one.